fundamental beliefs simply because you disagree with one or two teachings of that religion. We think that's incredibly harmful. We think that's exactly what that's exactly we think that's exactly the sort of rhetoric that Western liberal democracies themselves are against. We don't think that Western liberal democracies support the views that you could just trample the rights of all of these people because you disagree with it. Now we accept there are certain teachings that these religious institutions propagate that might be harmful to society. But what we say is that but trying to actually undermine religion itself is not a legitimate response to this. The legitimate response is to try and change religion, which we say that your policy does not do, which I'll discuss later, and secondly, something that it does not even attempt to do. What it actually does is isolate, all the people in this religion, and we think that that's completely illegitimate. Moving on to the second question. What is the effect of religion in society? Firstly, what we heard from the proposition is that all it does is it propagates hateful views in society. That's completely false. They completely ignored everything we told you in our first speech about how religion is actually socially valuable. Why is this the case? Because it promotes many, socially beneficial views, such as love thy neighbor, such as the pillars in Judaism and Islam, which say that you should give to charity, a certain portion of your income to charity. We think this is hugely beneficial. Socially beneficial teachings that religion propagates. So the model that the proposition is proposing to us today, which is to try and undermine religion itself and get rid of it, takes away from all these social benefits. Now, about the hate speech that some parts of institutions, and some of the most extreme religious institutions propagate. Firstly, we think that as they themselves pointed out, we have hate speech laws that ban this. So we're not standing for that on the opposition. We don't have to come up here and say that we accept hate speech against all these communities. As they themselves rightly pointed out, the KKK was banned for this very reason. You don't need the proposition's model to stop this. But secondly, we think in Western liberal democracies, religion is already changing. No, thank you. We think that it's already changing, and we've seen it do this many times in the past. Firstly, when it came to racial segregation, we've seen churches come past that. Secondly, when it came to discrimination against women in congregations, no, thank you, ma'am, and they're right. So we think that they're coming forward on that too. And now they're moving forward on the LGBT community. We pointed to the example of the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, one of the religions that was most ardently against the LGBT community, coming up and saying that he's not in a place to judge. So we see in these societies, no, thank you, sir, that they're already moderated. So we don't think that the policy that we're proposing is necessary, and as we've already mentioned, it's illegitimate. But now let's actually move on to what the effect of this policy is actually going to be. Is it actually going to create change as the proposition one, or is it going to make things worse? Before I go into this, yes, ma'am.
If religion is changing and a certain portion of figures that still exist within the status quo, outside gives empowerment to the youth, most vulnerable individuals that need it. How does your set of progression considering there is a certain portion of individuals who are still empowered?
It seems quite crazy that what you're saying is you're empowering the youth to make these choices. What you're actually trying to do is undermine religion itself. And you completely ignore the idea that actually by doing that, you're going to detract from your cause. Because if you try to attack religion, we don't think these religious institutions are just going to stand there and let the government do this. We don't think religious institutions are just going to stand there and say, hey, the government is trying to influence our vulnerable children, we'll just let them do that, and at the same time we'll moderate as well. We think there's a bit of a lack of logic in that argument. But let's discuss that in more detail. Now, what we've heard from the proposition is that, like you said, if you try to undermine religion by having the government actively try to reduce the religiousness of the population, you're going to magically solve the problems of religion. You're going to see these people, like you said, who actively try to eradicate religion. You're going to see these people moderating, and they're now suddenly going to accept homosexuals. We don't think that's true. Let's look at why. Firstly, we see that these children still have other influences under the policy that we say. We still have parents and other extremely influential sources, politicians, parents, and other extremely influential sources around. So we don't think the policy changes anything in the first place. But secondly, what the policy does do is that it is a direct attack on religion. How? Because you say that religion is incompatible with society. You're saying that religion, simply because of one or two views, simply cannot exist. That is what the proposition's model is doing by trying to create a less religious society. And this actually is worse. The message set out is worse when you target the children, because what you're saying is, we're going to take away your children and make them believe something that's completely opposed to what you believe. And we think that, creates huge sense of insecurity to the people going to be viewed as an attack on them. What is the effect of this? What we see is that any impetus for change in the status quo, as we talked about the moderation that's happening already, any incentive to do that is reduced, if not negated completely, because now they're going to blame these very people. Thank you, sir. What they're going to do is because the change that they've already done, the change that they've already incorporated, is not being recognized, and they don't have any incentive to do it in the future. But even worse is the idea that, no, thank you, ma'am, that because this government is going to say, oh, you're not recognizing the rights of homosexuals, we're going to try and actively undermine you. We think that the homosexuals are the ones who are going to be targeted when the propositions model comes out. We're going to say that the homosexuals are going to be blamed for the government's actions. They're going to be blamed for the government coming out, I'll take you a moment, sir, coming out and saying that things are wrong. And that's actually going to mean that religions are going to be far less likely to actually change, because they're going to be actively incentivized to clamp down on these groups far more than they are in the status quo. We heard from the proposition that these religious institutions aren't going to get involved in political campaigning because they'll lose tax exemptions. Firstly, we think if your policy comes into effect and you're trying to reduce the religiousness of the population, we think tax incentives is not going to be a big enough disincentive, far less incentive for them not to get involved in political campaigning. But secondly, the majority of their power comes from the fact that they have a huge audience. They're going to preach from the pulpit now that the homosexuals are paying in society far more than ever before because of this incentive. So we think that they're actually going to actively campaign for political candidates who believe in those views as well. So we don't think that we do think that there's a huge political power that these religious institutions have. Finally, we never really have a response adequately from the opposition on the people leaving real education. As I said, that's an acceptable consequence. We don't think it's acceptable to make children suffer for the use of such extreme faction of religion. So because we told you that it's illegitimate for the propositions model to come to practice, because we told you that religion is a positive influence in society, and because we've also told you that the policy will be ineffective, we are very proud.
Firstly, you tell people that all these aspects of religion are wrong in the first place. because of this choice, we think all it results in is further the alienation of these minority groups who in many cases are already disenfranchised from the state. So because today on our side of the house, we think that the state best fulfills its duty in providing them free choice to people, and because on our side of the house, the effect that this has is not negative, does not create backlash, and protects minorities. We tell you that the state's guarantee